Hey there, it's the Economancer. Back once again. I want to start this video off by saying if you got spammed with something, I do apologize about the previous video. I did take it down. For some reason my mic wasn't working, and that's hilarious to me. Okay, so we're jumping into the stuff that we started with pressure groups or special interest groups when we looked at what they mean, why they exist. You know, we have this insulated group of individuals who are policymakers and politicians, as well as like think tanks and stuff like that. And then we have to break through that. And one of the best ways to break through that is through special interest groups that provide interest articulation to the policy domain so that they can, basically understand what people want. And so what we're going to be going into today is this government's budget equation with political influence functions. And this comes from Gary Becker's work on a theory of competition among pressure groups for political influence. Gary Becker is one of the greatest economists to have ever lived, and the reasoning behind this is because his mind was able to branch not just the narrative, so the homo narratus kind of idea, but it was also able to add in the homo economicus and more fluently was able to look at the sociological or anthropological factors that exist in society and try to come up with ways to understand them. And we'll get into that in the very end. Now, this is just a brief run-in on some of the mathematics and some of the ways that he goes through this, but it's not meant to be an end-all be-all, and I will probably add on to some of this later. So let's get started. Kind of an overview of what we're doing. We're going to be looking at pressure groups, kind of explaining what that is, what its mathematical derivations look like. And then we're going to be looking at influence function and pressure. And this is the paper. It's Becker, 1985. And also you can look at it, the Quarterly Journal of Economics, August 1983. All right, so we have two groups. All right, and this is going to be subsidy and tax group. So you have one group that's going to be taxed and one group that's going to be subsidized. They may share existence together, but that doesn't mean that there's not two groups in competition, because what this means is I want to tax someone else and I want a subsidy from that tax. And we're just going to assume in the beginning that each group is homogeneous, so we can say they're roughly the same size, so on and so forth. And then when we're looking at them individually, they're internally identically individual income. Which means it's the same, right? Okay, so we have our subsidy group. This is post-redistribution income. So that's what this RS is total revenue, right? So we have at the point 0. So this is prior to redistribution. And then we have the subsidy. So if we want to see how big the subsidy is, we have the post-redistribution income minus what they originally had as income, and that gives you your total. For the tax group, we have it kind of the opposite. If we're trying to look at how much is totally taxed from this group, we can see their original income minus what's taxed from them. All right, and so ultimately we have this amount that's raised by all taxes, right? And that's this S. And so what is this part of the equation here? So this is S is equal to the number of people being taxed as a function of the revenue of taxation. Cool. All right, so now we're looking at the subsidy group. Well, if we're looking at the subsidy group, we can say that, all right, so this G is the cost of government. So we have the number of people getting subsidized is a function of how much the government is able to redistribute, which by the way, this R is redistribution. So redistribute to the subsidy given the total of S, which is the number of people taxed as a function of the total of redistribution of that tax. Because G here is the government, that can also be a constraining function later on. We can say in a perfect world with lump sum taxes where there's no government administration costs, then it's perfectly fine. This is your difference between your first theory and your second theory of welfare. But we know that is not the case, because we do know that one of the largest government constraints that exist is, for a lack of a better term, the government and their willingness to actually move money from one person to another because it costs money to move money. And that's, your administrative constraint. There's other parts of your administrative constraint. If you watch any of my videos on taxation, you'll see that that's an integral part of taxation, and we're adding it here. All right. So we also have deadweight loss. So why do we have deadweight loss? Well, if you look at the amount of money that's redistributed and you look at the amount of money that's returned in taxes, revenue of taxes, they're not the same. That is because, one, you have deadweight loss associated with the subsidy. So this could be such as you're not willing to, they're going to distort people's hours of work, some of their investment, and other choices that they would make given that they're a recipient of that subsidy. And then same with taxes. We know that taxes, it's going to be adding in some deadweight losses. This is going to be looked at hours work, different investment strategies, and then also on taxpayer choices. That could be their given taste or their preferences for being taxed. So they may want to be taxed, but they may not want to be taxed as much or at a high amount. So now we're going to get into, oh, by the way, they're not equal. Also, because we know that those two different functions aren't roughly the same. Taxation may have more deadweight loss than the subsidies, and then we also can think that we have this G function here, and if we don't assume it to be non-existent because it is greater than 0, then we can say, hey, yeah, they're not going to be equal, because the cost would reduce the subsidies below taxes, so on and so forth. But we know that that's not something that's going to happen because the government administrative costs are more than 0. So obviously you can't give all of it because it has to be spent to redistribute it out. All right. So here's something to think about. For the amount of raised in taxes, we have this function. So this influence function depends on the pressure exerted by S and T and other variables X. So what does that mean? So we have the number of people being taxed, and we have this as a function of the revenue or a function of the redistribution is equal to the negative income, which is the amount of pressure supplied by S, the amount of pressure supplied by T, and the amount of pressure by X. So this is how much pressure the subsidy group can influence a politician, how much pressure a tax group can put on a politician, and then we have X, which could be environmental variables and stuff like that. And then the inverse is true when we're talking about the subsidy function. So that is the number of people for subsidy, and then we have that government function there as a total of the redistribution of subsidies. And then we see that it's equal to I to the S, which is a function of the amount of pressure given by the subsidy group, by the tax group, and by other variables. All right. So now we're going to be thinking about this kind of more broadly. Well, if those two are basically inverse operations, that means they're going to be equal to 0. When we have I to the S plus I to the T, that's going to be equal to 0. That means the aggregate influence is 0. Now, again, this is what we're saying is that there's an equality between that which is raised in taxes and the amount spent on subsidies, which means we can have this influence group decrease the influence of tax group, would reduce the influence of the subsidy group, and then back and forth to some equilibrium. And so if you're looking at this political model, it's zero sum in influence. So you can't just continue to grow to pi to get differential influences. And then we have a negative sum in taxes and subsidies because of deadweight losses. All right. Now we're going to be looking at pressure. What do we mean by pressure? So we have this idea that you're going to be able to spend resources to lobby the government to do something. And so if we have this competition model, we can say, which by the way, this right here is wrong. This is meant to be here, so on and so forth. I apologize. Threw this together terribly. So we have this here. So the total of subsidy, so that's our initial income plus what we're trying to get through subsidy minus what we're willing to spend to lobby so that we can receive more in subsidy. And you always want to make sure that what you spend on lobbying is greater than obviously what you're getting in return. Same over here. So we have those who are being taxed, they have this function here, minus what's getting taken away, minus what they're willing to lobby. Now, you're thinking, well, that seems really unfair. It looks like those who are taxing are paying a lot more, which they are, but they also have a lot more to spend, roughly speaking. So they're able to try to influence it. But we do have these two negatives that are keeping down. All right, so here's really the important part of looking at this competition model. We can sit here and say that the amount of resources that are spent to lobby can make huge differences, but we actually don't know that. There's some evidence that says it is, and there's some evidence that says there isn't, but it's hard to say. So this is what Gary Becker points out. He says, I've assumed that influence functions depend only on the characteristics of and the pressures exerted by political groups and not on taxes and subsidies, the number of persons in each group, the distribution of income, or other variables. Now he goes on to talk about that the influence may also depend on subsidies if voters mistakenly believe that certain subsidies, minimum wages, or oil elements contribute to desired goals rather than the incomes of particular groups. If influence functions were affected by taxes, subsidies, and other policies, the analysis in this paper might have to be significantly modified, including the conclusion that efficient taxes tend to dominate inefficient taxes, which what we're going to end up doing, we're going to be going next episode. We're going to be looking at his work when he's looking at his proposition 1 through 4. And then we're going to be looking at the corollaries of those propositions, which is going to be stuff like, let's see, proposition 2 implies tyranny of the status quo, that the political sector would not interfere with much of the private distribution of income. So, here is another important statement made by him. He wants to make it very clear in this that his approach departs from previous approaches and that it's more radically from the cooperative game tradition. So if you looked at any of the other work on political behavior and stuff like that, a lot of it's a cooperative game. And it's not so much about the competition, it's more about the cooperation. But if you've ever watched any of my videos, I'm a big fan in trying to get people to understand that there is cooperation and there is competition. And those can drive different selection pressures and evolve the situation more greater. Okay, and then the last thing to think about with his work, and I think this is probably the most important from this, and this is what I took away and really loved about Gary Becker and why he makes sure that people understand that there's more to the situation. He's going to make the claim that he's presented a theory of rational political behavior without mentioning any voting. He says, this neglect is not accidental because I believe that voter preferences are frequently not a crucial independent force in political behavior. These preferences can be manipulated and created through the information and misinformation provided by interest pressure groups who raise their political influence partly by changing the revealed preferences of enough voters and politicians. This gets into the work done by Albert Hirschman and his Voice, Loyalty, and Exit, and how firms or political components can build loyalty into their brand, even though their brand will negatively impact those who are consuming that brand. You can think about this with a wine company. They can build a loyalty into their brand, and as their as their brand quality kind of slips lower and lower, the people's idea isn't to initially just to exit, it's to voice an opinion, to create this interest articulation function, much like we have in the political system, to tell the company, hey, if you don't buck up, we're going to leave. Now, this gets like crazily difficult in analysis when it comes to political factors, because you can imagine the amount of voices that are in competition for favor, for subsidy, versus also having to think, I don't want to be taxed. So they're kind of at this dual pass where they want to reduce their taxes and increase their subsidies, but so does everybody else for the most part. And then you have some section of groups that are under like this veil of ignorance that they don't really care. They're just trying to go along with. So we have this one function of pressure that the special interest groups can apply to the government. And then we have another function of pressure, and this one may be cognitive pressure, where we have these special interest groups that are trying to change your mind. And if you want to think about this, you can think about this in current climate, where we have these ESG models, environmental, social, and governance scores, where now we're having an influence function from some top-down entity on other types of top-down entities, and so on and so forth. And because all of that is coming down, it's going to help change people's perceptions of what is and is not real. One way to think about it. But I hope that kind of makes sense, and I hope you have enjoyed this. Once again, I'm the Economancer, and thank you for jumping with me through the Economicon.